Well, welcome to TUJ. I'm Robert Dejarik from the Institute for Contemporary Asian Studies. I'm extremely happy to have our good friend John, whom I've known for a long time, and who's always a very astute commentator on everything having to do with Asia, whether it's economics, politics, or society. He's teaching right now at Sophia University. He's had a very distinguished career. You've been able to read about this in the invitation. So without further ado, just a few things. We have, in case there's an earthquake, we have an evacuation plan, right? And the thing to know is don't leave the building, because it's actually more dangerous to get out than get in unless we tell you to leave. Two, never leave through these glass doors, because that's really dangerous. So if we do evacuate the building, we're going to go through the other way, that way. So that's the first thing to know. Second thing, if you have a mobile phone, put it on vibrate. And also, we're recording this. So when you ask questions, if you don't want to be seen, if you want your voice to be heard, just ask a question from your seat. But we'd rather have you be heard and then walk up to the microphone. And that will be better both in terms of the recording, but also for the rest of the audience. So what we've decided to do is to have a very short, about half an hour, a little less conversation among ourselves, and you get the privilege of listening to us. And then afterwards, for about an hour, we get Q&A. So my first question to you is, you talk about stunted economics in Asia. And you, at one point you mentioned, for example, that actually I think 30% of Indonesian children suffer from physically stunted development. So could you comment on what this means?
Yes, is this on?
Yes, it's on.
Can you hear me? Yes, you know, the first quote about stunted, of course, is in a figurative sense, and the second is in a literal sense. And you know, the first main chapter of the book is called Asia's Stunted Economic Development. And what I mean by that is that apart from tiny countries like Singapore and Hong Kong, no major Asian economy or country has caught up to the world leaders like the US and Germany in terms of GDP per capita and in terms of you know, business and economic and technological sophistication. And one of my favorite statistics on this is that in Japan, the country that we are here today and we love so much, the productivity of the services sector is half that of the manufacturing sector. And of course, Japan has a world-class manufacturing sector, but based on the statistics, the services sector is way behind. And that also applies to the agricultural sector, which is even more behind. And so when we're seeing where the Japanese economy is stunted, they are two areas. And that also applies to Korea and also China. So stunted really means stunted economic development which is, you know, hasn't gone as far as it could go. Stunting in the literal sense that you refer to, this is a major problem in poorer Asian countries like Indonesia and like the Philippines, where malnutrition is a big problem. And malnutrition, of course, has many effects, and one of the effects is that you know, cognitive development is impaired because of the lack of nutrition. And that has a major effect on, of course, human capital development.
And related to this, no, you can't open a newspaper without reading about Asia's new middle class. And you're saying that it's mostly a myth, that there's no emerging middle class. So could you expand on this?
Sure. You know, in the press and hearing commentators, we hear most about the fact that Asia is winning the war against poverty. And of course, that's particularly the case in China, Southeast Asia. There's lots of progress in poverty reduction, and even in South Asia, lots of progress has been made. But the poverty lines that people use to analyse poverty reduction are poverty lines like $1.90 income or consumption a day, or $3.10 income or consumption a day. But moving out of this extreme poverty doesn't mean you're moving into the middle class. And of course, there's lots of talk about Asia's emerging middle class, but as I calculated, you know, the middle class is only about a quarter of Asia's population, and half of Asia's population is somehow caught between middle class and poverty, caught in a zone of vulnerability. And Yes, so I think that there's a lot of exaggeration about this rising Asian middle class. And most importantly, when analysts define or talk about middle class, they're talking about people who are living on $10 a day. And so I would even say that the calculation of the middle class is based on a very low bar. And so, you know, sure, Asian lives are getting better, sure, poverty is being reduced, but the number of people who are really moving to middle class is a very small part at this point in time.
And so what are the challenges for this Asian century to be actually realized?
In my little book, thank you so much to everyone for coming along. As you may know, our talk is based on my book, and
I'd like to point out also that John has very wisely made this book available for free on the web. So you can download it for free, or you can buy a hard copy from Palgrave Macmillan.
That's right.
I think it's really good that it's available for everybody, because that really expands the readership.
Yes.
So here it is.
Yeah, I mean, I was inspired, obviously, by the fact that I teach at Sophia University, and I'd like my students to be able to consult the book for free. So I paid a little fee to the publisher for that. And so challenges, I come up with 7 challenges in the book, and essentially I've got 2 economic challenges, one to do with global value chains and urbanisation, 2 social challenges, one which is economists call inclusive growth. I call it giving all Asians a chance. And demography is the other social one. Then I have 2 political challenges, which are democracy and economic crime. And lastly, I have for the 7th, really geopolitics, you know, the relationship between, in particular, China and the US and other major powers in Asia. So they're the 7 challenges. And they're all important in their way. And, you know, perhaps for someone like yourself, Robert, who's a fine geopolitical analyst, you know, the geopolitical relationship between China and the US is perhaps the most interesting or exciting aspect. And that is very important, because one of the reasons why Asia has done so well this last 70 years is because of peace. If we compare the first half of the 20th century with the second half, the big difference is peace. So that's very important. But other issues like demography are very important. We know here in Japan, aging population, declining workforce. China, similar situation. Korea, a similar situation. And, but I mean, other things like global value chains too.
Let's talk about this value chain, because one thing which you note is that if you look at trade statistics, at superficial trade statistics, you see, for example, that iPhones are exported from China. But you point out that actually it's much more complex, and that the bulk of the value of the iPhone is not created in China, but outside of the PRC. So you could perhaps explain this to those who are less familiar than you are with industrial global value chains.
Sure, thank you. You know, as I ask to my students all the time, you know, where was your iPhone made? And they all say China. And of course, the iPhone is assembled in China, as you say, and the iPhone is created through a value chain that starts in California with the conception and design of the iPhone. Then it moves on to the high-tech components, many of which would come from Japan, some from Korea, Taiwan, Germany, US. Then it's assembled in China. That's maybe the classic textbook example of a value chain. But another example would be your beautiful shirt, you know, which may say it's been made in China or Vietnam, but it's actually been designed in Milan, you know, in a beautiful Italian designer. And the fabric maybe also comes from France or Germany or somewhere else. And in a country like Bangladesh or Vietnam or China, all they're doing is sewing and cutting and trimming. And again, the assembly of the iPhone and the sewing of the shirts, this is only a few % of the total value of the product. Now, for a country like China or Vietnam or Bangladesh, being able to participate in global value chains in this way, it has been fantastic to boost development. It's enabled these countries to hook onto globalization. But what it also means is that they're only at the bottom of the whole production process, and they're only capturing a small amount of the total value. And so looking to the longer term, which China particularly is doing, what you need to do is somehow climb the value chain and try and do higher value added activities.
How does one do that? In other words, you know that it's easy to move from the bottom to the middle. That's what, of course, China did first and foremost, but a lot of other countries in East Asia, in South Asia, and in the rest of the world. But how do you avoid what economists call this middle income trap? That is, you go and then you hit kind of a plateau, and you are far, far better off than in the old days, but you're still way below in terms of GDP per capita compared to more developed economies. And a country like South Korea did manage to do that. I mean, South Korea in the 1950s was what would have been called the basket case. Now it's a highly developed country, not exactly the same level as the richest countries in terms of GDP per capita, but well above the middle income trap level. So how does one emulate that success?
Well, I think the efforts that China are making today provide an interesting case in this. And China is doing lots of good work to try and increase its value added, climb the global value chain. And it's doing things like, one, investing in R&D, research and development. China's investing massively in this. This is important for creating knowledge and technological capacity. Investing in education too, which China is doing a pretty good job on. But China is also doing other things which are becoming a bit controversial. And you know, China's objective of climbing the global value chain is very honourable, and it's what China should be doing. But China is so big and so important that it's creating some frictions. I'll give you a few examples. Firstly, China is now investing lots in companies, technological companies in US, Germany, other countries. Now, it's perfectly valid for a country like China to want to buy technology companies to improve its own technological capacity. However, sometimes our friends in the US and Germany and other countries get a bit nervous about the fact that their core technologies are being taken by China, being bought by China, and that this may erode their own technological capacity. This is a topic that we can talk for hours on. Another thing which China is doing, which is very interesting, is that China is sometimes saying to foreign investors, okay, you can invest in China, but please share some of your technology with us. That's part of the price of coming in. And China is such a big player, it cannot make that request of companies. Again, our German and American friends don't like this idea of what they think as forced technology transfer. China also sometimes says to companies that, okay, invest in China, but do it as a joint venture with a Chinese company. Or set up a research laboratory in China. From a Chinese point of view, this is fair game, c'est la bonne guerre. But, of course, you know, countries like, well, particularly Mr. Trump, he doesn't like this, the fact that China is pushing companies to do this. And lastly, which is perhaps the most controversial thing that China is doing, which is intellectual property theft. And this receives lots of attention in the media. And of course, you know, it's hard to defend intellectual property theft. However, we have to recognize that a few decades ago, Japan was doing the same thing. We have to recognize that 100 or 150 years ago, the US was doing the same thing, stealing technology from the UK. And so, you know, intellectual property theft is something we don't like, but everyone's actually done it. That's part of it. And so we see that China today has this honourable objective of developing its economy, honourable objective of climbing the global value chain, but for things like foreign direct investment, you know, forced technology transfer, forced joint ventures, and intellectual property theft, this is giving rise to you know, major tensions between particularly the US and China today. And, you know, and from a US point of view, of course, they are thinking of this in terms of the economics of it all, but they also think of it from a strategic point of view. They see China as being a big strategic competitor of the US, and that by getting US technology, US may be losing, and China's competitive position strategically is enhanced.
Well, this leads us to the geopolitical aspect. East Asia, including China, has been able to grow economically for the past 30, 40 years partly because the US-led system has maintained relative peace in the region. We clearly have a US president that doesn't believe in this system, that thinks that the US role should be totally upended, that's opposed to the alliance systems, that wants to undermine the very nature of US society. How does that affect Asia? In other words, how does East Asia operate once you take the US out of the equation?
It's, I mean, we don't know because it's happening right now, and we don't know where this will head. But, you know, a quite famous Australian, I'm Australian as you can all tell by my accent, a fairly Australian, important Australian geopolitical commentator, Hugh White, has written a piece just a few months ago. It's called Without America. And he had written some years ago a book about arguing that America should agree to share power in Asia with China, come up with a deal so that they can both play together. And he's now saying, I was wrong, because America doesn't need to share power with China. America's retreating, coming out. And so I think his argument is a little bit exaggerated. We still have lots of American presence here in Asia. And of course, Asia is very important for the American economy. The Americans can never leave here. But if we assume that there is going to be a substantial geopolitical retreat, this means that Asians have to live together. And you know, this means that Asians need to cooperate together and to adapt to a new regional power structure where China is currently the biggest economy in the region. And as I argue in my book, where perhaps in the next 50 years, India may become the biggest economy in Asia. I in fact argue a little bit boldly that the Asian century may belong to India, not to China. But you may have follow-up questions on this, because we can talk about this for hours.
Before we go on India, which will be the last question before we open it to the floor, you said Asians have to learn how to live together. Now, if you think of Europe, Europe had a period of non-hegemonic peace between 1815 and 1870. But also you have lots of examples of countries that cannot live together and fight each other. So how do we know that once you take the US out of the equation, there can be a kind of Congress of Vienna and we all live in peace, or that we're back to, say, Europe in the 18th century, where we spent a fair amount of time fighting each other, or Europe after 1870, where we build up momentum towards a rather large clash?
Yeah, I've read many of these books about sort of the potential for clashes in Asia, and when you read these books you might imagine US Marines in Tiananmen Square or the People's Liberation Army here in Ginza. But I would say that we are actually right now in the midst of a low-level war. We are at war now, and the war now that we're living is the modern war, one cyber. And yes, cyber conflicts are very, very important. And, you know, cyber aggressions are coming, of course, from state actors and non-state actors. Secondly, we have another aspect of the war that's on now is economic war. And just to give a couple of examples, you know, if a country does something that China doesn't like, bang, they sanction the country. We saw that last year when the South Koreans agreed to have the THAAD protection. THAAD is a missile detecting thing that would shoot down a North Korean missile if it came over. The Chinese and the Russians didn't like it because they thought the US would use this to spy on them. And a South Korean company, Lotte, gave up a golf course to the South Korean government to do this thing. So quickly, the Chinese government sanctioned Lotte, organized encouraged the Chinese people to not buy Lotte products. It made it difficult for Lotte to work. Another example, of course, the Philippines. When the Philippines brought the case regarding the South China Sea to the court in The Hague, suddenly Philippine exports of fruit to China were blocked. And so that's another example of the current war that's on. And thirdly, you know, we also have the information war that's on, and you know, to some extent, the West is a bit weak on this. I watch quite often the Chinese television stations, CGTN. And CGTN, some of you may know, it has an office, has operations in the US, and it can project its story to the US people in the English language. On the other side of the coin, CNN cannot operate in China using a Chinese language program that would have freedom of the press and projecting the programs to Chinese citizens. And this is just one little example where China is using power and the openness of Western society to, disseminate its message to that. And it's just one minor example, and commentators on these issues talk about the growing coercive power and growing coercive nature of the Chinese state in terms of its relationships with its neighbors. And so how Asian countries can live together, I'm really not quite sure. And I think that many of these things, if we really believe, and if it really happens that the US does retreat from Asia, there's going to be a settling down period as countries really get to be able to live together and work together. But there's lots of things to work out. And I think that there are so many tensions between Korea and Japan and China and Japan and so on. And then, of course, we have, India and China. That's just a few opening comments. I mean, we can talk about this for 100 years, quite obviously.
So last question before we open up for Q&A. India and China. So what are India's advantages? How does India really take off?
I think you all probably know that India started its rapid development about 15 years after China started. China really kicked off in 78, India in 1991. And since that point in time, India has been growing quickly, 6.5%, but not as quick as China has been growing. But I see India has a few sort of positive points in its favor. Firstly, if you believe the United Nations, in the year 2100, India's population will be 1.5 billion, China's will be 1.0 billion. So India will be 50% bigger in terms of population than China. Secondly, India has been growing faster than China in recent years and actually has been reforming in a way which is more, active than China. And if we look at domestic politics, I see China as being very brittle. We had an interesting talk here a few weeks ago with the French lady, and China is doing okay, but China is relying on repression to hold the country together, repression to maintain the Communist Party's dictatorship of the country. India, although it's a bit chaotic, although it has lots of corruption, its institutions, particularly the political and electoral institutions, work very much better than China. I think in the year 2100, India will still be India. In the year 2100, we can't be sure that the Chinese Communist Party will be in control. We can't be sure what may happen if the Communist Party loses its grip on power. And another just final point on India, the last elections, were very exciting from many points of view. What we saw was, the opposition party to the government won the election, and there was no problem at all in terms of the transfer of power. The Congress party didn't contest. There was no problem at all. India has a political system which is a bit chaotic, but it manages its democracy and it somehow works. I see this as being a very strong point. And there are many points we could talk about, the advantages of democracy versus totalitarian systems, but India, I also think that looking to the medium term, its open society and open democratic system will be more favorable to an innovation-driven economy. And I think that China's dictatorship will be something that holds back its potential as an innovation country.
Thank you very much. So now we open to Q&A. So raise your hand, and you will be recognized in a democratic fashion.
Thank you. Jeffrey Gilbert, and I work in the healthcare field. Turning away from the the economic and the geopolitical for a moment to the cultural. Do you think that in Asia Confucianism, on a net basis, is likely to be a positive phenomenon or negative? Positive with the uniformity of purpose, potentially negative with the group hierarchies leading to corruption and other undesirable outcomes. Thank you.
So thank you for the easy question. I was fearing that someone might ask a cultural question. I come from Australia and culture is not my strong point. No, but quite seriously, I think that Confucianism obviously is useful in terms of creating order in society because you have this Confucian hierarchy in society. And maybe at early stages in a country's development, this is good because in the early stages of a country's development, you basically need to educate the people and build a bit of infrastructure and follow what other countries have been doing, and having an orderly, organized process maybe is very helpful for that. And maybe countries like Japan, Korea, and China, in the early stages of the development, have benefited from the order of a Confucian society. As economies climb the development ladder, you have to become an innovation-driven economy. The US, for example, today, its economic growth is basically driven by innovation. China's economic growth today is basically driven by copying what other countries have been doing. And to be an innovative society, you need to have the freedom, the liberty to be a little bit unusual, to be a little bit crazy. And we look at interesting people in the US of recent decades. Steve Jobs, you know? I'm not sure how Steve Jobs would have come through in an innovation society. Mark Zuckerberg, would he have survived in a strict innovation society? I'm not sure. So my answer to my question is, in the early stages of the development process, maybe it's helpful. But in the later stages, when we need more creativity and innovation, maybe not.
I think that I'm always unclear as to what a Confucian society means. I mean, in other words, you've had quote-unquote Confucian societies that went through periods of enormous innovation and transformation. That's Japan from late Tokugawa to early Meiji. Disorder, political violence. I mean, people talk about order, but one thing I always point out is I think the most common form of consensus building in Japanese politics from, say, late Tokugawa to really the 1930s was assassination, which is consensus building, but is not what we associate with traditional Confucian order. Of course, you know, in Korea, we had a very active democracy movement that brought about the end of military rule. In Taiwan, we have democracy, not always very ruly. I mean, if you look at images of the parliament in Taipei, it gets pretty rough from time to time. So I'm always unclear as to, I think sometimes it's kind of used, but it's a little like so-called Asian values. It's used to justify autocratic rule. It's like, you know, well, our people expect to be ruled. You know, that's our tradition, which is a way of saying, I want to stay in power, so please don't challenge me. But I'm not always sure if it's really a Confucian way, Confucian society. And of course, Confucianism itself is not always well defined and varies from era to era and from society to society.
Yeah, I mean, quite honestly, I'm not really an expert on Confucianism. I'm an economist, if I'm anything. But, you know, I think one of the points you're making is that many societies which maybe claim to be Confucianist are not really so Confucianist after all.
Yeah, it evolves. I mean, you think, let's say you had to define a Catholic society. You would have said conservative, women stay at home, quote-unquote traditional. You look at Spain. Spain is historically a Catholic society. There's no doubt about it. Well, majority of the cabinet members are women. The queen is a divorced lady. It has same-sex marriage. Everything that we would have been told a long time ago is incompatible with quote-unquote a traditional Catholic society. But Spain as Spaniards have been converted in mass to Buddhism or to another religion. I mean, there's still culturally a Catholic society, but it has changed. So I think you can have a Confucian society that is very different.
But I mean, since we're such a small group here, I'd be interested, the gentleman who asked the question, what do you think? You know, you obviously thought a bit about this sort of question. What do you think about the answer to your own question?
Well, actually, I haven't thought about it a lot, but when I think of Confucianism, I think of a hierarchy of groups. And I think of all of the things that flow from that. A collection of Mandarin decision makers, as I mentioned earlier, uniformity of purpose. But I also think of it as being, as Robert said, every would-be totalitarian's ideal system in a way, because you create an artificial cohesiveness, and by selectively enforcing rules, you can essentially, on the one hand, enable corruption, but simultaneously favor those within your desired political circles to thrive. So that's about as far as I've thought about it.
Yeah, I mean, I've worked in Japanese organizations here, and you know, this strong hierarchy, which is part of Confucianism, exists in the working places that I've been. And this strong hierarchy is very good for an organization where people are following the orders, have a clear thing to do, and they do that. But the scope to come up with something new or something different is much more difficult. And the scope, I mean, in my experience also, the scope for young people to come up with something new or different is very difficult. And so that comes back to basically what I said before. But, so thank you.
Question? Yes, Erin?
Hi, Erin Gallagher. I'm with ICAS. That's why he knows my name. You talked about value chains and the idea of people trying to move up from, you know, this bottom rung to the actual middle class, both as individuals, but then also as nations. But if you consider, you know, the people in China who are building these iPhones, or the people in Bangladesh who are sewing these shirts, if they move up, what do we see happening in the future? How do we maybe prevent people from, you know, who are being paid these low poverty level wages from just moving to places like Africa? How do we kind of get people to move up the chain without just replacing the people who are even further? Thank you.
No, it's a very good question, and certainly in the case of China over the last 15 years ago or so has seen a dramatic increase in its wages. It's no longer the location for cheap manufacturing that it used to be. And as you're implying, I think, one thing that occurs in response to that is that, you know, maybe foreign investors shift their investment from China to Vietnam or Cambodia or Bangladesh or other countries, and so that, you know, a country, you know, can then lose part of its manufacturing. But what also occurs in a place like China is that over time, you know, as the demand for labour increases, wages go up, but also what is happening is that human capital has been going up, technological capacity is going up, and we find that in China's own smartphones, they are doing more and more higher value-added activities. And so the goal is that over time that your human capital increases, your technology increases, your wages go up, and that you start doing more and more sophisticated things. And of course, in the longer term, what we hope is that you know, these value chains in Bangladesh or in China, which are led by companies from, you know, advanced countries, that a country like China or Bangladesh can become a global value chain leader, not a follower. And this is starting to happen. I mean, in China, we now have Huawei that makes very good iPhones or smartphones. We have Xiaomi and so on. And of course, you know, maybe the classic example of a very innovative company, of course, is Alibaba. So climbing, improving technology, human capital, value added, and
Hi, my name is David Sussman. I'm a researcher at the Tokyo Foundation here in Tokyo. You mentioned a number of different factors, political, economic, social. If you could tell me about environmental issues, which I see as quite foundational. I've skimmed the book in certain places. Perhaps you get into detail there, but I would see natural resources and environmental issues as being critical for social progress, the economy being strong, etc. I'm wondering how that fits into your a book and organization on
Sure.
that.
If there's, there are probably many shortcomings in my book, and one shortcoming is that I don't have a chapter on the environment. And if I write an update, I'll do that. But I do have a section on the environment in the chapter on urbanization. And of course, for many Asian countries, the urban environment is a disaster. And, and it's something that needs to be very much better managed. And, from a textbook point of view, what we need to do for a better environment, of course, is to start making people pay for pollution, the polluter pays principle. And also encourage things like clean technologies and so on. In terms of resource depletion, again, is a very big issue, and maybe the biggest issue on the resource depletion side of things is water. And China has a massive water problem, and India also a growing water problem. And the management of water resources requires many, many things. Again, proper pricing for water, rather than just letting people use water willy-nilly. But there's much. A good friend of mine has won the World Water Prize, the Stockholm Water Prize. It's the Nobel Prize for Water. And he makes the argument that the biggest water problem, including in the US and countries like the UK, is water wastage. And water utilities in many of our countries are very, very inefficient, and there's masses of water that just goes dripping out of taps and dripping out of pipes. And so, David, you're right that resources are a major problem, and I would say that water is one of the biggest ones, and improving the efficiency of water usage is part of that.
How does one go about doing it? Improving water efficiency? Is it a question of regulation? Is it a question of economic incentives?
You need to work on both sides. Ideally, water should be priced like any commodity. And, in many advanced countries, water is priced like any one. And so if people are paying for the water they're using, in theory, they would use it efficiently. On the other side of the coin, there is the production side, the supply side of water. Now, in most countries, you'll find that water companies or water organizations are actually state-run ones. And so there's much that governments can do to push these state-run water companies to be efficient. And a lot of that comes down to just getting inside the companies and insisting that they become efficient.
Yes.
My name is Yoshio Kubo. I'm working on financial regulation field, and I'm not really I've not been trying to focus on Asia per se, but I wonder if what impact the current trade wars, quote unquote, may have on the state of play where Asia stands for the short period and over the long run.
Thank you very much for the question. The trade wars and Mr. Trump, it's really a fascinating topic. Mr. Trump, he argues that trade should be free, fair, and reciprocal. And he's right that trade is not reciprocal between, say, the US and Japan, US and Korea, US and China. The US market is much more open than those markets. And from his point of view, I think it's fair to try and push these countries to open up more. And, maybe the Japanese people will say they're open up enough, but the fact that Japan is actually running away from a free trade agreement with the US shows that there's a problem here. So he's right that there is a problem about the openness of markets, and from an American point of view, I think it's fair to want to push to open up. How do you get countries to open up their markets? The trade war is not the right way to go about it, and he's declaring of implementation of tariffs here, there, and everywhere. I think one, it is not solving the problem of market openness in other countries, and secondly, it's creating lots and lots of adverse effects for the economy and for international trade. And we referred to global value chains before. Mr. Trump doesn't seem to understand that trade now is done through value chains. And when you start putting tariffs on things, the amount of unforeseen consequences are massive. And the US is suffering from these trade wars as much as other countries. But another point which I think is important is that another aspect of the trade war is that Mr. Trump doesn't like China's intellectual property theft, the forced technology transfer, the forced joint ventures I referred to before. And so he wants to attack China on these things. And from an economic point of view, he's fair enough to do that. But the US is also worried about China becoming a technological competitor for the US. So there's a strategic aspect to this. And one adverse aspect of these trade wars is that, in fact, Europe, Japan, and other countries agree with Trump when it comes to Japan, comes to China, in terms of what China is doing. And so instead of declaring a trade war on Europe and a trade war on Japan, Trump should be bringing together all of his friends and bringing them together as a coalition to get China to change its ways. But by being a scattergun guy, he's making a mess of the whole thing, really. And we've seen the effects of these trade wars. You know, one country does something, then you have retaliation, and where do these things end? So in terms of the ultimate concern of the US, Trump he's right to some extent, but the way he's going about the problem is wrong. And secondly, the friends that he could use to help him, he's upsetting them too. But so it's a crazy show.
Leo.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm sorry for coming in late. Maybe I've missed the part where you kind of addressed the question, but I really want to follow up on the last point you were making. You said that the friends of the United States are going away. Is it going towards the Chinese? Are the Chinese benefiting from this trade war by simply, collecting the alienated friends that the U.S. has made? Thank you.
As a general proposition, as the US seems to be less interested in Asia and seems to be less interested in multilateralism and the international liberal order, that does create a space for other countries to move in. And China, at least in the way it talks, seems to be trying to take advantage of this. And of course, Mr. Xi is talking about the fact that China is in favor of globalization and trade and so on. But of course, what Mr. Xi is saying is not really 100% honest. China is not really an open market. It's not really a friend of globalization. But he's talking about this. Also through initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, again, the US has created space for China to move in. But most recently, just in the newspapers in the last couple of days, Mr. Xi is trying to make friends with Europe against the US. And from what I've read, the European governments are not keen to do that. They have, equal concerns about China as the US does, and they're not ready really to drop the US and join with China. And I think that if they were ever to do this, China would have to evolve in a very, very major direction before it became a close strategic partner of Europe. Please.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Very interesting story about the pattern of development, which seems to be different to the conventional idea of a simplistic development style of Asian countries. And that struck me to ask you two questions. The first is, I think, simpler. In the case, what kind of developmental pattern do you expect to emerge in Asia-Pacific region, such as China or India, Indonesia? And what kind of implication does it have on global governance? Thank you.
What do you mean by pattern of development?
The developmental sequence which the emerging Asian countries are experiencing. Such as what kind of developmental sequence does Indonesia have?
In terms of patterns of development, poor countries are typically agricultural countries. And as a country then sort of starts to take off, typically they, expand their manufacturing sector. And we've seen this particularly in the case of China and Southeast Asian countries as they've attracted foreign investment in the manufacturing sector. And then, of course, beyond that, advanced countries become more specialized in the services sector. One of the shortcomings in countries like Japan and like Korea is that they became excellent world beaters in manufacturing, but have not really become world beaters in the services sector. And this requires many things, but basically it means opening up markets. And when it comes to the services sector, the leaders in Asia are, of course, Hong Kong and Singapore. When it comes to the financial sector, it's the leading financial capitals in Asia, they're Singapore and Hong Kong, and other aspects of the services sector, those two countries. So in terms of the pattern of development, for countries which are climbing the development ladder, Japan, Korea, Malaysia, I would say, and Thailand, they need to concentrate on building up the services sector. I don't know if that answers your question. Global governance, the pattern of global governance, and Robert can probably answer this question better than myself. The pattern of global governance, of course, was determined at the end of the Second World War. And we see this in all the organizations like the United Nations, the IMF, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, and so on. They're dominated by Western countries. And Western countries, of course, have been reluctant to, share power in these organizations with emerging countries. And you're from Japan, I guess? Yeah. And, Japan should be a permanent member of the UN Security Council, and so should Germany. But the adjustments that should be made, as things have developed since the Second World War, haven't been made. And so one of the things that we are seeing, particularly in the case of China, is that, of course, China has created the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, essentially because the US were blocking giving them more voting rights at the World Bank and the IMF. So China is saying, okay, we can create an institution for ourselves. When it comes to development assistance and so on, they've created the Belt and Road Initiative. And so we're in this situation where the existing structure of global governance was established in the Second World War, dominated by the West. The West is now a declining share of the world GDP, and it's reluctant to share power with other countries. And so China particularly, it's creating its own systems of international organizations. We also see lots of informal groupings. After the Second World War, we created these formal organizations, IMF, World Bank, United Nations, and so on. Countries are now, I suppose, increasingly grouping together informally. And we see this in Asia where Japan, India, Australia, the US are working together against China in a way. And so I'd say that in addition to the creation of new organizations as China is doing, more informal groupings and informal networks.
I think to comment on this thing, to some extent, I think this system of global governance was indeed created first and foremost by the U.S. In the late 1940s, but I think it's proven, I mean, at least until the U.S. went off the road, fairly flexible, because I think to some extent Japan's underrepresentation at the international financial organizations and the UN is a product of Japan's government's own choices. In other words, Japan never really seriously pressed for a permanent seat at the Security Council. I mean, there are very, very few Japanese work at the World Bank and the IMF. It's not because the IMF, and I mean, I think I remember looking at statistics, I think there are more Australians than Japanese at the IMF, and Australia has a smaller population, though I think you're wrong. Australia also has great cultural tradition, so maybe that's why the Australians were there. But I think it's mostly because Japan is incapable or unwilling to supply economists and professionals to join these organizations. There are lots of cases where Japan could have taken the lead and didn't, though it's true that now with TPP-11, without the US, finally Japan stepped up. But there are countless examples where the door was open for Japan to take a larger role in the past 10, 20, 30 years, and for good or bad reasons, the government here decided it was better to be a backseater and to keep a low profile. I think China's a little different because China's relationship with the international order created after 45 is complex. I mean, it's benefited a lot from it. It's also challenged it. So that's much more difficult. But I'll ask you a question relating to the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. US and Japan decided not to join. For reasons I fail to understand, a lot of Japanese officials were surprised that the Europeans joined, even though it was, I think, a given. Was it a mistake on the part of Tokyo not to say, well, you know, why not, after all, if we will benefit from this? I mean, was it the right decision from a policy point of view in Japan to oppose this?
I think it was wrong for both the US and Japan to oppose. And, you know, for two reasons. The rise of China and China's power is a reality. We can't sort of pretend it doesn't exist. And the idea of containing or stopping China is just totally unrealistic. And thirdly, I don't see that the AIIB is really that important in the overall scheme of things. You know, Asia needs more infrastructure, there's no doubt about that. Another bank that brings more finance to doing that is a good thing. And I don't see it as being something which is life or death in terms of global governance. It's not something worth fighting about. It's not really a security issue or anything. And, you know, the US and Japan certainly should have joined, and certainly in the case of Japan, they should have. For the US, maybe it's complicated with Congress and so on. But your point on the TPP is important, and I forgot to mention that. And I mean, that's Japan should be proud of doing that. You know, when Trump pulled out of the TPP, no one imagined that the TPP would survive, and no one imagined that Japan could take on a leadership role. And they did a great job, and you know, I think this is encouraging in terms of, you know, we were talking a little bit before about the fact that, you know, how will Asia survive without America? Japan has shown through the TPP that it can do things, and I think this is great.
Why do you think, oh, sorry, Sarah.
Hi, so my question does touch upon TPP-11, the one that Japan has led recently. But on the other hand, we have China, their One Belt, One Road initiative. There are some issues with that. There are some complaints. For example, the Chinese, they go to Africa, create new infrastructure, but then simply leave without the essential knowledge for the native people that live there. And then we have Japan, who led the new TPP-11 without US participation. Do you think they have the potential necessary to kind of counter Chinese influence today without the US help?
The first question, Belt and Road, the first one. Yeah, the Belt and Road initiative, of course, has attracted much commentary. And I think that in terms of thinking about the Belt and Road initiative, looking at the cases of Sri Lanka and Malaysia provide interesting insights. And in the case of Sri Lanka, the Chinese state-owned enterprise built an airport, they built a port, they built a cricket stadium, and of course they did this in cooperation with the former president, who maybe was a little bit corrupt and benefited from this himself. And basically Sri Lanka has been left with infrastructure which has very little value. They've been left with a massive debt. And the Sri Lankan people themselves didn't really participate in the construction of these things. So there was very little spin-off benefits for that. And so, to use the term that people use these days, Sri Lanka has been caught in a debt trap. And the way that they've partly got out of this debt trap has been to basically give the port to a Chinese company. And the whole thing really is a bit of a disaster. The Chinese did this project in cooperation with, a corrupt leader and a leader who really wasn't concerned about his own people, but it's quite costly for the country itself. And of course, by giving up the port that they've done, when you're dealing with China, when you give up property, you sometimes don't only give up ownership, you give up sovereignty. And so, although the Chinese government has promised to only use the port for military purposes in agreement with the Sri Lankan government, many people are worried, and of course particularly our Indian friends are worried, because we have this Chinese port 100 miles from southern India. More recently, of course, we've seen what's happened in Malaysia, and of course the former Malaysian Prime Minister got involved in these massive infrastructure projects, apparently greatly overpriced, not obviously very useful, and so these Belt and Road initiatives, these two examples, and perhaps even the one in Pakistan, Gwadar, there's a port on the southwestern corner of Pakistan. It seems, in short, that these projects may be more useful or interesting to China than the countries themselves, and the countries are bearing large costs associated with that. And when we think of the question about Asians living together, China has a great opportunity to be a nice leader of Asia in the same way that the US has been basically a nice leader of Asia. But projects like this make China's neighbors very suspicious of China. And I think China really needs to be more intelligent about these things. And I think it's in China's interest to build up its real soft power rather than imposing itself on its neighbors. China can't really compete in a normal way with China. Japan can't easily compete with China. China is just so big. And China, of course, has this massive stock of foreign exchange reserves, still $3 trillion. And, I've spoken to friends about China's relationship with Africa. And they've told me Japan just can't compete with China when it comes to Africa. The Africans ask for money, the Chinese just say yes. And so it's difficult. But, there are many important countries in the TPP. And, I think we shouldn't underestimate the TPP. The TPP includes, well, it doesn't include the US, but it's an important thing, I think. And I think, China, even if it wanted to join the TPP today, it can't, because the TPP includes a chapter on labor rights. It includes a chapter on state-owned enterprises. It's really a high-level trade agreement. And it's a trade agreement which actually is also the right type of trade agreement for global value chains, because in global value chains, it's not just about trade, it's about investment, it's about intellectual property, and so on. And so all of these things are included in the TPP, so it's a good thing. So, I think that it's a big plus for Japan.
To follow up on Africa, and I have a rather dark view of the Chinese Communist Party's long-term objectives. But I find some of the criticism of what China has been doing in Africa a little strange, because they say, well, they prop up dictators. If you look at the US and European record, it's not very different. saddled countries with debts. That's also, others have done it. But also, to some extent, I mean, Africa has its population is growing very quickly. I think it's fair to say that, no, with all due respect to the IMF and the World Bank, their solutions have not been very successful. That there are countries that seem to have benefited from Chinese investment. And in the end, that benefits probably the US and even more Europe more than China. I mean, it's in everybody's interest, and probably first and foremost Europe's, that Africa grow. You know, I mean, Ethiopia is doing much better than it used to. That's good for everybody. So up to a point, I wonder whether we haven't been a little too critical of Chinese activities in Africa compared to what others have done. Also, there have been lots of Chinese immigrants in Africa, and some of them have also contributed to economic development.
Right. I mean, in short, I agree with you. You know, when it comes to Africa, you know, it's very hard for the West to be moralistic because, particularly during the Cold War days, you know, Western countries, you know, were not very successful at all in Africa and used Africa as a political part of its political game. Secondly, although I've criticised these Chinese projects, Malaysia, Sri Lanka, and perhaps Pakistan, you know, not every Chinese project is bad. And, you know, and in Africa, there's probably many projects which are actually quite positive. And so, and again, in Africa, Asia needs infrastructure desperately, Africa even more desperately. And so if the Chinese can bring infrastructure there to some African countries, it's a plus. But of course, usually the main motivation of the Chinese in Africa is to be able to get access to resources. And you know, the revenues from those resources rarely go back to the people themselves. They often go back to some dictator. But as you say, it's no worse than what the West has done in the past.
Other questions? Yes, Tom.
Thank you, John. I wanted to ask, you haven't spoken about ASEAN organization today or the Shanghai Cooperation Council. So in terms of those two multilateral organizations, could you give us your perspectives on those and to what extent they're contributing to regional economic growth, and what else, what other organizations you know, could be brought into existence to improve cooperation around the region? And again, I just looked at your resume. You're former OECD person, and if you look at the membership of the OECD countries, we only have 4 from Asia: Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and Korea. So I'm wondering if there's more that could be done by those organizations to bring, you know, the Asian economies into the mix and build economic growth. Yeah.
So Tom, thanks so much for the questions. You know, ASEAN is, many people criticize ASEAN as being a weak, toothless tiger that has never done anything much at all. And there is some truth in that, but you know, if we go back to the time when ASEAN was actually created, you know, there were lots of political tensions in Southeast Asia, you know, between Indonesia and Malaysia and Singapore and its neighboring countries and so on. And ASEAN has been helpful in terms of, you know, just the political relations between the Southeast Asian countries. That's been a big plus. And ASEAN has been also pragmatic in terms of opening up countries like Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam are more recent members. And by bringing them into the group, that's been a very positive thing too, because these countries had their own political problems, were left by the wayside. ASEAN kicked off as being a political organisation, but over time has evolved into an economic organisation as well. And an important part of that has been the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement. And again, it's not a perfect free trade agreement, but it is better than nothing, and it has helped the economic development in the region. ASEAN has also played a much broader, important role in Asia. And you know, with Northeast Asia being the most important part of Asia, but also a part where countries are always fighting with each other or arguing with each other, ASEAN has become the meeting place where other Asian countries get together. And so we have many processes like the East Asian Summit and so on, where broader groups of countries. And so in the political area, the East Asian Summit, and then in the financial area, we have the Chiang Mai Initiative and so on. So ASEAN has provided a great meeting place for countries to get together from the region. As part of that, there is a free trade agreement which is being negotiated right now called the RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. It's a little bit weak as a trade agreement. It doesn't in any way compete with the TPP. I'm doubtful that it'll ever be finally agreed, but they're talking about it. And so I'd say that ASEAN's glass is very much half full in terms of economic cooperation, political cooperation. And it's very good. And, you know, if somehow Northeast Asia could replicate ASEAN, where countries that argue together can finally start playing golf together and singing karaoke together and become friends, that would be great. So it's a very interesting model, and it's not just Northeast Asia which can learn, South Asia. Of course, South Asia, we have, you know, particularly Pakistan and India, which hate each other and so on. And so if you compare Southeast Asia with East Asia and South Asia, it's way, way ahead in terms of living together in peace and prosperity. ASEAN, though, is now under stress from our friend China, of course. And of course, China doesn't like the idea that this group down there is powerful, and China likes to cooperate with ASEAN countries on a bilateral basis, and China likes to undermine agreements from ASEAN meetings. We've seen this particularly when it comes to statements regarding the South China Sea. And China is very close to Cambodia, and Cambodia is a country that acts on behalf of China in ASEAN. So from a political point of view, ASEAN, I'd say now, is under threat. And it's a problem. And, you know, it's easy for a country like China to pick off ASEAN countries and try and break it up. The OECD, you're right, the OECD only has 2 Asian members, and that being Korea and Japan. In the OECD as an organization, in theory, you have to be a democracy, practice human rights, and be a market economy. And of course, that excludes some Asian countries. The OECD does cooperate with lots of what it calls non-member economies. So the OECD does work very closely with countries like China, ASEAN, and so on. But it does so on a basis of them being non-members. And the OECD, in a way, is anachronistic. You know, the OECD is a Cold War organization. It's a descendant of the Marshall Plan. You know, back in the old days, it represented the West and so on. And it can't shake that identity. And I think that maybe it weakens the OECD a bit that it still has this identity of being the club of the West, the rich man's club, because there's lots that the OECD can do out here. But as I say, the OECD does work a lot in Asia, and particularly on technical issues, which are very, very important. You know, one of our most famous projects is education, PISA, the Program for International Student Assessment, which assesses 15-year-old kids' literacy, numeracy, and scientific capacity. Very important project for countries to be able to see where they are. And so the OECD can do good work. Yeah, please. Yeah, I mean, Mexico joined the OECD when Mexico used to be a friend of the US. And of course, it also was part of NAFTA because, you know, the OECD, you know, included or includes, you know, the European Union, a regional grouping. It includes Australia and New Zealand, which is also a regional grouping, and NAFTA is a regional grouping. And so when that regional grouping was considered important, NAFTA, of course, that was a good reason for Mexico to be a member. And of course, the Mexicans, you know, although Mexico is a poor country in a way, the top Mexican people are very, very bright. And Angel Gurria, our Secretary General, is a really impressive guy. Have you met him? Yeah, very impressive guy. And he's been doing a good job. And so, you know, I think, you know, our American friends may not like it, but I think we should be proud and happy that Gurria has been Secretary General, and he has played a big role in getting the OECD working in the G20. And of course, that's important because the G20 is a nice big organization, but it's not in fact an organization. There's no secretariat. And so the G20 needs organizations to actually do the heavy lifting, do the work, and the OECD can do that on all sorts of things, from corporate governance, taxation, competition policy, education, health, and so on.
You mentioned the OECD, and in fact, it was originally obviously linked to the Marshall Plan. Japan's been a member for a long time. How many Japanese work at OECD? I mean, it's by far the second largest OECD economy. So how big is the Japanese presence among the senior staff, the economists?
You're right, Japan, 1964 was a big year in Japan. Japan hosted the Olympic Games, it had its first Shinkansen, and it joined the OECD. And, it was a great event for the OECD when Japan joined. Japan makes a very important contribution to the OECD, but as you're implying, unregrettably, very few staff members. And there are many reasons for that, and obviously language is one aspect of it. But I think that for many Japanese bureaucrats, in the way the Japanese system works, it's not a very attractive option. And most OECD staff members actually make a career of working at the OECD. And in fact, you need to spend quite a bit of time there to really get involved in things. But in the Japanese bureaucracy, often what happens is that people have a job for 2 or 3 years, they're transferred elsewhere, and so on. So at the OECD, we sometimes have Japanese staff members who come in for 2 years and then leave again and don't have really the time to make a contribution. And so it's unfortunate that there are very few who actually work. And some of the most successful Japanese staff members at the OECD are, of course, women. And of course, I was speaking with you about this earlier. And of course, this is partly because in Japan itself, the opportunity for women are less than men. And so the idea of working overseas is perhaps relatively more attractive. And so we have quite a number of Japanese women who do well. I should say it's not just to Japan. Korea is basically the same too. And I think that, as we were saying earlier before, the Korean system, the Korean bureaucracy works in many similar ways to the Japanese. But for Japan to improve its global footprint, it needs to find a way to get its people in.
Well, are there any young Japanese in the audience? It's time to send you CVs and go. It's at La Muette, right?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
The Chateau.
At a chateau in Paris. I mean, it surely beats Kasumigaseki. Question, yes.
My name is Keith Bound. I am a retired businessman. I was impressed with your what you mentioned about the innovative society has to have accept some craziness. And my question is about China's future development. And I believe the economy to develop, there has to be freedom in speech, thinking, and expression. And then the God's hand, which Adam Smith said, will work. And in the past, planned economy has never succeeded. And in China now, it's kind of a hybrid, a planned economy and market economy. And I wonder how China will develop in the future. My understanding is China has to change its policy, give more freedom to their people to develop in the future. That is my question.
No, but I fully agree with you that this is a major issue for China. And, back when Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao were in charge of China, we started to think that maybe China might open up a little bit. And of course, since Xi Jinping has been in charge, China has closed down. China does have some interesting entrepreneurs, and China is doing interesting things, particularly in the technology space. Jack Ma and Alibaba, Tencent, and companies like this. But, you know, the restrictions on freedom of thought, freedom of expression, freedom on the internet, all of these things will hold China back. And, you know, from what I understand, the grip of the Chinese Communist Party on companies, including foreign companies, is much greater now than even before. You almost have a parallel management system at the top with the Communist Party sitting inside there. And, you know, for Japan, I think that, you know, Japan has always been a technological leader here in Asia. And I think that this is a great opportunity for Japan to, you know, confirm and improve its technological excellence. Because I think China can't compete with you for the reasons that you're saying. China is the intrusion into the education system of the Communist Party since Xi has been in charge. And, you know, there's more, you know, students now have to learn Xi Jinping thought, and there's more controls over that. But what is even worse is that there are many foreign universities operating in China, and the controls over them is, you know, becoming strict. And academic freedom is so important for creativity and innovation. And, you know, we see in the US, Silicon Valley and places like this, you have universities and think tanks and the government working together in a very open way. We also see, and the OECD stresses this very importantly, a lot of innovation is conducted through open innovation, companies working together, even companies working together across borders. And that requires lots of openness. And if one side of the partnership is communist, it's very, very difficult. So in terms of my optimism about India versus China, I think this is a very important part of it. So thank you so much.
But let me take the advantage of holding the microphone to ask the last question. You mentioned that China was going gold before it was getting rich. That, of course, is a problem, as you note in your book, that is being faced by a lot of other Asian countries. I mean, I don't know, Thailand has a total fertility rate of 1.5. And Thailand is also, I mean, it's richer than China, but it's not a rich country the way Japan or South Korea are. So how does demography play in?
No, but you're right, Robert, that in Asia we have essentially two groups of countries. We have one group of countries which you'd say are demographic deficit countries, where we have rapidly aging populations and low fertility. Japan, Korea, China, Thailand is the other one, and Vietnam is moving in that direction. Singapore and Hong Kong are the same cases, but those countries have admitted lots of migrants, which has compensated for that. Then, of course, we have population surplus countries like Philippines, Indonesia, India, and most of South Asia. And you know, there is scope for migration between the two groups of countries. But you know, for a country like the countries we're talking about, if the working age population is declining, there's lots of things that the country need or should do to address that. And of course, you know, we talk about womenomics and migration and so on. But particularly in the case of, I mean, this is in Japan, and this is the last question. For a country like Japan, I think the big thing is lifting productivity. And according to the Bank of Japan, Japan's potential growth rate, you know, its sort of maximum medium-term growth rates, less than 1% a year. But Japan's productivity is 30% lower than the US. Now, somehow, if Japan could lift its productivity, you know, it could grow faster, and that would be the best compensation for an aging population. And that argument applies also to Korea and to China. And Richard Solomon had an interesting article on his thing recently about how labour shortages may be pushing Japan in a more sort of efficient direction. And to the extent, I mean, I read about this in the newspaper every day, robots are coming everywhere in Japan. And if we replace people with robots, this can lift productivity massively. And so I think that you know, this fourth industrial revolution, the digitalization of everything, has a great potential to help compensate for aging populations. But one last thing, just to leave on a, you know, maybe slightly provocative thing. Looking over the medium term, I think that declining populations in Northeast Asia are a good thing. I think that Korea, Japan, China, the populations are too big. And if somehow we can transition to a population which is a bit smaller, it'll be very good for the environment, it'll be very good for urban congestion and so on. Getting there is costly, but if we have improvements in productivity, that can help pay our way to that. And if you look at demography from a long-term point of view, you go back to the 19th century, I think then Japan's population was 40 million, and it's gone to 120 or plus in 100 years or so. And I think that, you know, we need to, if we pull it back, it would be a plus.
Surely that's what's happening here. So thanks a lot, John. We're really grateful that you took the time to come here. This is a book that is both very interesting and very readable. I mean, generally books about economics can sometimes put you asleep. But this is very, very lively, and I think it's a great book. You learn a lot if you're already knowledgeable, but also if you're teaching, I think it's a perfect book to use as a textbook in class. So thanks again. And thank you to Emily and to the student workers